So, Qualitative Educational Research by Luttrell, Chapter 28, Writing the Wrongs of Fieldwork, Confronting Our Own Research/Writing Dilemmas in Urban Ethnographies. So here's a little timeline, table of contents of what is involved. The second bullet point, Foucault, I took that out. It was just a minor mentioning, and I wanted to research it for myself, so I did, but I didn't think it was relevant for adding it into this chapter, so I did take that one out. So the researchers, we're going to be going over who the researchers are. Weiss and Fine are the researchers. We're going to introduce them, get their purpose, and then the conceptual theory that they are using in this chapter for the research that they're doing, called Others. So it's pretty interesting. And a theoretical framework, which is the right stories that they get from, I want to say Richards. So there's things in qualitative research that the researchers are having issues with if they are doing work for social change. So they call these kind of the aches, the headaches. So first of all, defining community, defining race, and then ethical dilemmas. When you get data that's bad, and this just means like data that can be viewed as bad depending on the people who are taking in that data. Things that are mundane, safe spaces, reflexivity, where research meets voice, and then writing the actual research findings. So post-structuralism was mentioned in this chapter, so I just kind of did a quick outline of what post-structuralism is. So post-structuralism obviously comes after structuralism, and structuralism was all about the oral, how things are interpreted in words. Post-structuralism is saying that, well, knowledge is contextual. It's unstable. So the way we perceive knowledge or reality is how we tell those stories to ourselves, how we interpret it. So reality is an attempt to ascribe meaning to something that might be meaningless, but it's the way a person internalizes and views the situation. So the meanings are going to be unstable, changing, and contextual. And the authors do show that in their research, how people from the same community, same households, can view things differently or choose different topics that they want to talk about and share, where the other person from the same household won't even mention that topic. So the reality is going to be different with how people internalize that. So that's post-structuralism. So here are our researchers. We have Michelle Fine and Lois Weiss, and they self-identify as Jewish white women academics, and they're critical ethnographers. They are trying to do work with qualitative research so that way they can help with social change. So they want to bring things to light, not just so that it's brought to light, but so that something comes of it. And they've faced a lot of criticism, a lot of pushback. So they even quoted that they're trying to find a few friends. Let me see what bullet point that is. Trying to build the... We toil on, so I think it's the last bullet point. We toil on, looking for friends, writing for courage, searching for a free space in which social research has a shot at producing both social theory and social change as the world turns rapidly to the right. So in this chapter, they are going to explore those ethical issues and how many of their friends are turning away from qualitative research because it's just getting too difficult with those ethical dilemmas, and people are more interested in looking at the research formulations and how research is conducted, as opposed to actually being, quote unquote, in the field doing the work. So their purpose, they start off with, what does it mean to do critical work in our provincial backyard? So this article, they conceptualize it as a coming out about the methodological, theoretical, and ethical issues that percolate from field work. So they're trying to start the conversation that they say a lot of people shove down and don't really bring to light about the research and ethical dilemmas, and they want to bring this out into the open for the people that are the next generation of researchers. So they're saying this is something we need to look at now for the people that are coming up after us. And so they're pleading for researchers to be critical, self-reflective. They work in something called a hyphen. So the essay is an attempt to review how qualitative research projects, quote unquote, others. So they say that they're speaking now because they worry that they're studying an apocalypse merely to study it. So the conceptual theory of others, and this comes from Weiss Fine with working the hyphen. So qualitative research projects have othered the people that are the participants in the study. So much qualitative research has produced discourse of the quote unquote other. So with the researcher, they're separating their self from the person that they're researching. So that hyphen separates, but it also can merge at the same time. So it's a duality of the personal identities with our invention of others. So I thought that was pretty powerful, like how you invent other people from what they tell you or their actions, what you think you know about them. So the self-other merge, it's in the politics of everyday life, is an argument that they say. So researchers will speak of or for others, but they will exclude themselves. So researchers can no longer afford to collect information on communities without that information benefiting those communities in their struggles for equity, participation, and representation. So they're really trying to get that hyphen to be the positive hyphen, not the hyphen that excludes or separates, but it's that hyphen that merges together the researcher and the participants. So, just having that humanity. So making sure like our participants are, we view them as people where we can see ourselves through them. So the framework they use is from Laurel Richardson, and it's Write Stories. And so what this basically is that researchers need to account for how they write their stories. So this is really part of reflexivity. So stories about how we came to construct the particular text we did, accounts of how context, social interactions, critiques, review processes, friendships, academic settings, departmental politics, all of these things can affect how you actually construct the text and how you write it. So what Richardson is saying in this Write Stories is that needs to be transparent. And that's what this chapter does show. So Weiss and Fine are going to tell us about a study that they did, but then they're going to be telling us how they came up with certain things and the ethical dilemmas. So the participants for the study that Weiss and Fine are using in this chapter is that they wanted the perspectives of Latino, African American, and white young adults ages 23 through 35. They want them to narrate their own educational, familial, and economic biographies. They wanted to see what their reality was And this is in the 1980s and 1990s. And so they wanted the biography of the Reagan and Bush years. They wanted to know how the politics of certain things like welfare and public services, how these were actually affecting these classes of people. So they did 2 cities. They did Buffalo and Jersey City. And through the oral life stories of poor and working class, white, African American, and Latino young adults, they tried to unravel the transformations in the urban, economic, racial, social, and domestic relationships that transpired. So their methodology, they had these 2 cities, Jersey City and Buffalo, and they were trying to find equivalent participants. So they ended up having a sampling problem when it came to the African Americans. So their sampling problem was related to race, involving the struggle to find equally poor and equally working class African American, Latino, and white young adults in both cities, so that the comparisons by the race and ethnicity wouldn't be compounded by class. So they were able to find poor and working class whites, but when it came to trying to find the African American participants who were comparable in the poor category or the working class category to the whites, they had a big issue with that. And so they say that that's the unacknowledged impact of the 1940s and 1950s U.S. federal subsidies for the white, working, and middle class. So despite our meticulous combing of race neighborhoods, our ambitious search for sampling, comparability lost to the profound lived realities of multi-generational poverty disproportionately affecting poor and working class families of color. So they talk about community. This is something that they say is kind of like an ache in their head, just trying to figure out what constitutes community, because the sense of community is fictional, it's fragile, it's vulnerable to external threats, internal fissures. So coherence, that organizes life within, whereas difference defines life between. So we're trying to find that coherence in community, but then there's also those differences. So different stories from within the same community. Stories are contextual and derived from a myriad of factors affecting experiences such as race, ethnicity, gender, class, income, sexual orientation, etc. So basically, people can live in the same community and have different experiences based on their realities and the lens from which they have to live based on certain factors. So simple demographic fractures by race, ethnicity, gender, class, generation, and sexuality marble inside each city. So for example, I'm quoting the book, African Americans will refer to local police with stories of harassment and fear, whereas whites are far more likely to complain about a rise in crime. Within the same households, we hear white working class women describe growing up in families with much childhood exposure to alcohol and abuse, whereas comparably situated white men raised in the very same homes and neighborhoods are virtually silent on these topics. So you will get different interpretations of the same community from the participant from which you are receiving their narrative. So race, this is another category that they said was, kind of an ache in their head. So race is a place in which post-structuralism and lived realities need to talk. I really loved that quote. So race is a social construct, but race in a racist society bears profound consequence for daily life, identity, social movements, and the ways in which most groups, quote unquote, other. Yet the life stories as narrated are so thoroughly raced that readers of the transcript can't not know even an anonymous informant's racial group. So basically, when they will have their graduate students do the transcripts, they can guess what race the person is by their narrative, just because of the stories they're telling, just because of the experiences that they've lived. They're able to pinpoint what ethnicity this person is. So when it comes to personal stories of violence, family structure, the style of their narrative, their history with money, marriages, access to material resources, relations with family, with the state, and just descriptions of interactions with the police. They're all profoundly narrated through race. And in the book, they did quote W.E.B. Du Bois with this quote: "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line." And they said he was probably prophetic within 2 centuries. So he was mentioned in the book, and that's why that was added on this slide. Okay, so moving on to ethical dilemmas. So bad data is basically when somebody tells you something that you are not anticipating to come up. So you're asking a question and they start talking about drug abuse or child neglect or domestic violence, how they're cheating the welfare system, like this data starts coming up in a conversation that, wasn't intended for this. So this is an ethical dilemma. So the bottom quote: "We continue to struggle with how best to represent treacherous data that may do more damage than good, depending on who consumes or exploits them. We present these as dilemmas in which all field workers must currently struggle. There's nothing straightforward or objective about reporting or withholding these types of data." So that's bad data. Mundane, things that are just boring. They're basically calling out researchers, saying that researchers scan their transcripts for things that are exotic, bizarre, violent, that a lot of the humanization factor is the mundane. So walking your child to school, reading a newspaper, just doing normal life things that make people, and not leaning so much towards those things that are more like juicy. So including the mundane to be able to paint a more accurate portrayal and depiction of the participants. They brought up safe spaces. And so they were saying in communities will have safe spaces where, people can just find, I like how they worded it, find a small corner to breathe in peace. And so these safe spaces are really important to these communities. And so as a researcher, they're saying, okay, well, there's this ethical dilemma. Like, do we try to infiltrate these safe spaces? Do we report? Do we gather data on these safe spaces? So they're saying, so these free spaces have raised questions that need attention. When should these data about private free spaces float into public view? Do we have any business floating through writing about these sequestered quarters? And then if they do, does our social scientific voyeurism shatter the sanctity of that which is presumably free? So that was an ethical dilemma. Of course, self-reflexivity, that is an ethical dilemma. So it is acknowledged that we as critical ethnographers have a responsibility to talk about our own identities, why we interrogate what we do, what we choose not to report, on whom we train our scholarly gaze, who is protected and not protected as we do our work. So it's that self-reflexivity as a qualitative researcher, what are you reporting and why? How much of our relatively privileged lives do we insert into essays when we chronicle lives under assault from the economy, the state, and within communities and even homes? Yes, we write the stories, we determine the questions, we hide some of the data, and we cry over interviews. So it's that self-reflexivity of you're actually coming up with the questions. You're actually writing the stories. And if you're going to be crying over certain pieces of the narrative, what is that saying about yourself? What are you bringing into this research? What more can we say than that we are two white Jewish women deeply committed to a better world? The post-structuralist question of who are we is an important one indeed, but what does that mean as we weave together lives of passion, pain, and assault? A narcissistic look at self seems misplaced here. Whiting ourselves out seems equally wrong-headed. So I thought that that was a pretty powerful quote, and I'm still kind of wrestling with that, where they're saying, whiting ourselves out. So that's something I thought, okay, I want to make mention of that because I want to go back and reflect on that. The triple representational problem. In our text, we ponder how we present ourselves as researchers, choreographing the narratives we have collected, the narrators, many of whom are wonderful social critics, whereas some are talented ventriloquists for a hateful status quo. So, you're asking people questions, they're going to give you their opinion, and some of it might just be like regurgitated opinions that they're consuming from media, etc. The others who are graphically bad-mouthed by these narrators. So how do we respond? Do we have a responsibility to theorize the agency, innocence, collusion of these folks? When white men say awful things about women of color, do we need to represent women of color, denounce and replace these representations? If not, are we not merely contributing to the archival representation of disdain? I think that kind of goes back to that bad data too, where you ask someone a question and you're like, wow, I did not expect you to have this kind of response. How do theorists respect the integrity of informants' consciousness and narratives, place them within social and historical context, and yet not occlude or dignify his perverse denigration of people of color? So when you get that data that's bad-mouthing people in certain categories or certain, demographics, however the case may be, what is that? How does the researcher present that data? So that, when you know that this is wrong, this is not okay, they shouldn't have said that, what do you do moving forward? When method and voice meet. So this was really interesting. Depending on the method that is used, you'll get different narratives. So if an individual interview is on the column to the left, and then a focus group is the column on the right. So if you get an individual by themselves and you're just doing a one-on-one interview, you're going to get a lot more negativity. This is what Weiss and Fine have found, that there's going to be a lot of like victimization, hopelessness, things of that nature. And then in juxtaposition, when you have a focus group, there tends to be more possibility, more identity. Like people of like-minded, when they come together, like-minded communities, they are able to build hope together and have more sense of commonality, and more hope will emerge. So collectives are more likely to generate stories of possibility and hope. And let me see if there's anything else critical that we wanted to go over. So basically this chapter is about ethical dilemmas on what we write and how we write it. So the bad data, mundane data, safe spaces, self-reflexivity, and then when method and voice meet. So the researchers are trying to let us know that there are a lot of obstacles in the way as far as ethics when writing about participants and different groups, when you are trying to have this purpose of invoking social change. You want to raise awareness, but yet you're obligated to report what people are saying. And there's that struggle of being in the field and collecting this work and then representing it. So they bring up a lot of points and they want to start this conversation that they say a lot of their colleagues are avoiding and leaving the field of qualitative research. So that was chapter 28.